Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and of course, one of the great big stories of the past week is the tragedy, the crash of the Germanwings flight, which has been a source of enormous speculation, much of it groundless. But the value of speculation sometimes is what it tells us about ourselves, rather than necessarily what it tells us about an incident that of necessity we don't yet understand. And when it comes to speculation about the crash, our good friend, this program's good friend, Mark Ames, has written a piece on that. He joins us now to talk about that and whatever else we touch upon as we're talking. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on again, Richard. I'm glad you framed it that way because I think you're exactly right. I mean, the way we speculate wildly, baselessly about major events, really says a lot about what our basic assumptions are about what's going on and what causes these things. You're absolutely right, because that's kind of what my piece was about. And then also bringing up, why isn't the labor story one of the things they're speculating about here?
Yeah, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, your angle on it, because, first of all, I imagine, but I don't know, you'll tell me if you agree with me on this. I was just stunned by the blatantness when people were asking, is it terrorism? And the response from the authorities over there was, no, we looked into it. He's a German by descent and Christian. Yeah. So that's out.
Yeah, of course, because, as if the guy in Norway, what was his name, Anders, the crazy guy who shot as if Nordic people don't do terrorism. I mean, there is that possibility, sure, that he was a right-wing neo-Nazi terrorist. I mean, just because he was German suddenly, okay, well, then
Anders
maybe he must have been a troubled kid.
Anders Breivik killed 92 children, Christian terrorists.
Right.
Just saying, But you brought up the labor angle, and you've written a book about this, actually, haven't you?
Yes.
Going postal.
Yeah, about how the squeeze, basically the squeeze, which combined union busting and inequality and sort of the big change in the corporate culture that really went into overdrive since Reagan's time. Coincided with the rise of these workplace massacres, these so-called going postal massacres. And as I wrote in my book, one of the sort of earliest examples of that was when a fired employee of U.S. Air and PSA. So PSA was the big airline in California when I was young. It got bought out by U.S. Air in '86. And an 87 employee, a 15-year employee was, even in books by sort of psychologists and police profilers and so on, they all said really the way he was handled when they fired him and mistreated him after being a 15-year employee, he may or may not have stolen $60 from from the cocktail receipts, basically from a flight. He begged the supervisor several times to think about his family, to let him back in, to put him on probation, anything. And the guy said no. And this was at a time when the PSA union, Pacific Southwest Airlines union, had been basically decimated. So they didn't really have any protection anymore. Somebody standing up for them. And this guy, clearly thought that was it for him. So he boarded a plane with a gun. He used his old badge and he shot the supervisor that fired him, who was on the plane, and then killed the pilots. And the plane crashed. This was 1987, late '87. It crashed in coastal California and killed 43 people.
So here you have this employee, David Burke, put under pressure, disgruntled, let go. And causing a very similar to this theory anyway, an incident where bringing down a plane, airline employee bringing down a plane, causing mass murder and suicide. Now, obviously, this is, as you say, it's groundless speculation, but in this case, it does highlight an important issue, which is you talk about Germanwings pilots. It's amazing that nowhere in all of this where they're going through his medical records. He had a medical excuse, apparently, which he tore up. But last month, you point out, only you, of all the reading I've seen on this, Germanwings pilots, which presumably included Andres Lubitz, is the name of the pilot in question, staged a 2-day strike over pay and working conditions.
And benefit cuts. And, you know, but, I mean, what's happening in Europe with the airlines there and with Lufthansa introducing its own budget airlines to compete with the other budget airlines, it's the thing, it's what we've seen here, you know, for 30 years now or more, is happening there a bit more slowly, but it's a similar process where, you know, it's a race to the bottom for wages and for benefits for workers and protections. And of course, you know, the people at the very top will only benefit from that. And so, I mean, I've written about this as well. I mean, look, obviously a normal, healthy person, no matter what, hopefully doesn't kill himself and certainly doesn't kill other people as well. So that's kind of a definition of you know, having a mental health problem, I think. The question is, to what extent did the workplace environment contribute to that? You know, why was the killing? Why did the suicide take place on the job in the workplaces? What's going on there that might have contributed to this? And I think in a lot of these cases, you find that you know, particularly where there's a squeeze going on, that it does contribute. And, you know, piloting is a very stressful job as it is. And certainly in this country, as we've learned over the last few years with a couple of crashes, pilots are getting paid worse and worse and worse. In this country, they're talking about pilots who have to take second jobs just to survive.
Which is not what you want it's not, you don't want your pilot working the night shift before he gets on and flies your 250 passenger aircraft across country. And we're talking with Mark Ames about the Germanwings crash and whether or not, which we don't know, labor conditions played a price in it. You know, I remember when I was in high school, being an airline pilot was a very high status position. I think I took a girl out. His father was a pilot. It was a terrifying experience. I mean, to ask him permission because, and to leave the house with her and to be told, you know, if he says, hey, we're back by 10, she's back at 9:45. But not only they had status, they had influence, they were paid well. Now they're being driven down, like so many categories of workers here in Europe, they're being driven down the status scale. And it's interesting to me, Mark, that what we're allowed to talk about in some of these public incidents and what's taboo, meaning you're allowed to say, for example, when that doctor shot all those people at Fort Hood, the emphasis was on his Islamism, understandable, but you weren't allowed to talk about his mental illness issues, which he had, which have been reported and documented. In other cases, for example, when I've written about right-wing violence, you're allowed to talk about the mental illness, but you're forbidden to even talk about the fact from left and right sometimes. I've been excoriated for mentioning that the guy who shot the Unitarians in Knoxville had Sean Hannity's book on his shelf and Bill O'Reilly's book on his shelf and Bernie Goldberg's, 100 people who are ruining America. And he said he was going to go down that list one by one and kill them all. You're not even allowed to mention that. So I guess, do labor factors fall under that taboo category?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw on social media some people were calling me a Stalinist or a communist, or just for mentioning it, you know. And it just and I mean, I tried to be as clear as possible that what I was doing was engaging in the same kind of baseless speculation, but based on actual instances in the past. And there is an instance in the past where there was a labor angle. I mean, there are very few of these, where pilots, where pilots or somebody on board, intentionally crashed a plane. So if people are going to say, well, in the past there's been terrorism, or maybe somebody had a mental illness issue. Well, there was also this case in America. Actually, it's probably the most similar in many respects, which involved labor abuse, basically, labor abuse and stress on a worker, and somebody was really could have been treated a lot better. And the person himself, David Burke, who shot them and took the plane down in California in 1987. Again, this is a guy who was on edge, who did have, it was alleged, a potentially violent side, or when he was at that time, he was actually fighting employment discrimination suit. He had taken it to the California Fair Employment Board and alleged that white people were being promoted over him. He was African American, Jamaican American, and he was in the middle of that suit, and that had caused him a lot of stress fighting that, as it would. I mean, I've read about. There are a lot of cases of these. Of course, it's very stressful, and then he gets fired over this. This instance. I mean, to him, it was like the world was over, and no one was there to stand up for him. And the union had basically just been busted the year before. The PSA union had been, as part of the deal of the merger between PSA and U.S. Air.
Well, first of all, Mark Ames, I can't resist saying that I think your reporting on this has been outstanding, and I do not think your Stalinism or communism has... You've allowed that to prejudice. I'm joking. Please, social media. I'm joking. What I'd love to do is take a quick break, and then we will come back and maybe just wrap this up and talk about a couple other things you've written briefly. If you got the time, Mark?
Sure.
All right. We're going to take a quick break. We will be right back. I am Richard RJ Eskow with Mark Ames. This is The Zero Hour. We are back on The Zero Hour with writer Mark Ames, who is known for his many writings, his 3 books, his founding of the Exile in Moscow. We're just to wrap up, Mark, on the Germanwings thing. Again, great piece in Pando Daily. That's pando.com. And just to close off, it fascinates. If we lived in a different culture that wasn't, in my opinion, driven by corporate values, I guess I'll just close on my side by saying this would be something a lot of people would be raising as a theory. I mean, but you have, for example, Don Lemon on CNN talking about the Malaysian flight. He's willing to speculate that it fell into a black hole, but people aren't willing to speculate that this guy might have been stressed out by labor conditions.
Yeah, or blame Putin. That's the other thing. Blame Putin for. Well, I mean, I've heard that the Malaysian air flight over the Pacific, it was Putin's fault. I think somebody in New York Magazine wrote that. It's. I guess for some reason it makes people uncomfortable to think about it, because then you have to really think about inequality not as an abstract and as a moral abstract, but as an actual concrete thing that affects people's lives and may even be deadly and blow back to anybody at any time. I think it's very threatening, but it's obvious. I mean, it's obvious that we should. I wonder if in Germany, in the German press, I don't read German, if this was one of the things that they did discuss there, but I don't know. I don't read German, but, they would have been more acutely aware of the fact that Germanwings pilots had just gone on strike over conditions.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about a couple other pieces you've written lately, and you've written several that kind of caught my eye, but one you wrote a couple of weeks ago that we had the civil rights, we had the Department of Civil Rights and the Justice Department came out with a report on Ferguson and how basically the minority community there is being sucked dry financially in every way possible by a kind of for-profit government that seeks to find them and pursue them and put them in the criminal justice system. You found a document where the mayor of Ferguson, white, by the way, bragged about privatizing law enforcement services months before the shooting of Michael Brown. What was that?
It's an interview. It's not a document. It's on YouTube. I don't know if they took it down by now, but it was an interview with one of those. You know how you have all these all of these libertarian institutes and think tanks in first in Washington, and then of course in different states. And this is the sort of the leading billionaire-backed libertarian institute in Missouri. I don't have the article in front of me right now. I can't remember which billionaire, besides, of course, the Koch brothers, backs this one. He's a local billionaire. And they had on the Ferguson mayor because this institute had just, I think it's called the Show Me Institute, if I remember right. This institute had just put out a whole, they made 2014 their year of like privatize everything in Missouri. And they held up Ferguson as one of their shining examples of privatizing as much of as possible of municipal services as a shining example of how well it works. And they had this guy on, and he was boasting of everything that had been privatized, including, and as much of the criminal justice and law enforcement system as the public would bear at that time, including, he talked about privatizing services mostly, like, red light cameras, speeding cameras, and then, of course, by making the city budget revenues dependent on basically busting as many people as possible and hooking them into a cycle of constant debt and warrants for their arrests and so on. When you basically have an offender-funded justice system like you have in Ferguson and a lot of cities, that's a way of privatizing it. And actually, as I wrote about last year, this is a blueprint put forward by the guy who's credited with pretty much mapping out the first blueprint for privatizing municipal services. His name is Robert Poole. He's he's the founder of the Reason Foundation, which is another one of the Koch brothers outfits. Of course, Reason magazine is their main product.
Yeah, you and I did a whole segment on Poole, and it's appalling, and now we have proof of it. And hey, welcome to our dystopian future. We're talking with writer Mark Ames, and speaking of dystopian future, you wrote one of my favorite sentences because I write about this tech stuff from time to time. Last time I did, by the way, this guy who runs, I'm blanking on his name, Raimondo or something, Guy Raimondo, he tweeted, he and his followers started tweeting at me that, because I criticized Uber and the Uber business model. He said, another statist submits to the authority. And I thought, side with the billionaires who are buying our government from us. Way to stick it to the man, guys. But this is one of my favorite. Mark Ames wrote this. If you can think of something truly horrible and dystopian, it's a safe bet that it's already a VC-backed tech industry doubling in size every year. Man, ain't that the truth? And you were writing about voice biometrics.
Voice print technology. I couldn't, because I'm an old fan of Russian literature, and Solzhenitsyn, his book First Circle was my favorite book of his by far, which takes place in the first circle of hell. So it's the nicest VIP gulag. It's basically a research and development gulag for scientists, and they're tasked with coming up with something that's impossible, which is a technology that can make basically like human fingerprints, but out of voices, and therefore you can find anybody who's made a phone call, even if they did it from a public phone or something, you can identify them. And that's what they're trying to find, a whistleblower at the time. And the scientists are trying to sort of stretch it out as long as possible in order to not be thrown back into the ninth circle of the gulag hell. And lo and behold, it's actually, the Sand Hill Road and the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley that have actually created an entire industry. It's a reality now. Governments and corporations have already now collected something like 65 million at least human voice prints where you can identify anybody by the different tones in their voice, which each person apparently has a very unique identifier. It's pretty scary. It's just creepy.
Yeah, I was horrified by this. You found it from an AP report from late last year that the measures the characteristics of a person's speech as errors expelled. It's just, it sounds like it's, first of all, it sounds like you can't game it by talking like this. So
I know,
which is a drag.
Yeah.
Secondly, how did they get 65 million voice prints? In other words, so that if I make a call, like a machine can say that's Eskow. How did they get 65 million of them?
That's a great question, and I remember always wondering. I used to use Google Voice a lot because it had a lot of advantages, and then it would give you this printout. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine Google Voice is not one way that they've been working on it, testing it, modifying it. That's what Google. I mean, Google's a pretty evil company, and and they lure us in by offering us really nice, good, free services, and it's basically like a kind of dystopian trap where they offer us the cheese of some low cost phone calls, and then we eat the cheese, and next thing you know, they've got everything on us. And then the question is what they're going to do with it. I mean, they're certainly going to monetize it and exploit it and sell it to as many people as they can. And then you can sort of go from there. It's just. It's kind of overwhelming, Richard. There's so much of this, so much of what we learned from, the Snowden files and what we've learned just like from Yasha's reporting and so on. It gets overwhelming that all the different ways that corporations and the state and law enforcement and so on can track us and follow us. And all you can do is sort of write about it, not like it, not accept it, fight it, but also not let it. I mean, what can you can't let it sort of paralyze you or change your behavior in any significant way.
That's the thing. That's the thing, Mark Ames. That they're doing far more than we can imagine. And by the way, your Solzhenitsyn, William Blake said everything real once was only imagined, which fits in this case.
Yeah, that's good.
I have a cat that I didn't realize was in the studio here that is now trying to get between me and the camera. Okay. She just jumped from a high height. Sorry about that. Okay, so we'll close with this, which is, we're being watched in ways we don't know. In this case, animal ways. So,
a Google cat, huh?
She was watching me the whole time. Google is, speaking of Google, it's helping to fund a group that's trying to kill Obamacare in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. You wrote that, though.
A lot of them, actually. Yeah. So that would be the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is another one of this constellation of Koch-founded front groups. This is a DC-based one. It's mostly known for its climate change denialism and for its, boosterism and PR for the tobacco companies. But that's sort of because it's more publicly sexy, I guess, in an evil way. But actually, the CEI does a lot in terms of lobbying for and doing PR for companies that have antitrust problems. It's very much against any regulation, particularly antitrust regulation. And then it also turns out that they were the ones who crafted the King, lawsuit in the Supreme Court to pretty much gut Obamacare. They're the ones that came up with the strategy. They found the plaintiffs. They're bankrolling the lawsuit. The CEI is behind it. And, what we know about is that Google has been funding them in one way or another since at least 2008. And that, this kind of came to light in 2013 when the CEI held their annual dinner fundraiser in Washington, D.C., and it turned out that Google, even more than the Kochs, more than Monsanto, more than Murray Energy, Google was the number one sponsor of this annual fundraiser. And Facebook was, in the top 10.
See, what amazes me about this, Mark, and why I think it's important is because Mark Ames is because, among sort of liberals, Democrats, whatever, there's this sense of, well, they're all pretty cool, at Google and at Facebook. And excuse me while I address the cat for a second. Did Eric Schmidt send you? Why are you watching? No, but I mean, they are collecting an enormous amount of information, and they're backing some very right-wing causes, and I think it's important. I guess to wrap up, what's the theme in all this? We're not thinking about labor. We're not allowed to talk about labor as a society. There's a kind of programmed in taboo, certainly in the media. And as far as privatization is concerned, we know what we think about that. And then Google, you called them evil. I mean, I know people who say, well, they're nice people who work there and that sort of thing, but social
true,
impact.
but that doesn't mean they're not collectively evil. But it's probably true that a lot of them individually are very decent people, I'm sure, and don't see themselves as doing evil, except at the very top. I doubt Schmidt has any illusions anymore. But yeah.
Oh, I don't think so. He said that. Yeah. He said privacy is dead. Yeah. I mean, I guess. So I guess we mythologize technology and all that, but we don't really think about its impact. So what are you going to be working on next?
Right. Well, I mean, to get back to what you were saying, is there kind of a common theme there? And I would say yes. It's sort of the atomized individual against just the almost paralyzing, overwhelming power of, really of corporations, of technology, and just organized corporate power. And it is daunting and you have to remember that under probably far worse circumstances, 100 years ago, 80 years ago, and so on, people were able to unite periodically in this country and organize and change some things for the better. It's just the only way. It is absolutely the only way. Doing it individually and becoming paranoid and hiding and atomizing ourselves just will never change anything. We'll just be whinging forever. But the only way to fight organized corporate power and make the state work better for us, and not only in their interest, is just organizing. And that's why labor unions are so important, even as they're being whittled away.
And I think at this point we need a consumers union for technology too. Maybe we'll form one together. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks as always for joining us, Mark Ames. Great writing, great thinking, and enjoy the conversation.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on, Richard.
You bet. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard, RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.